So with that, I would like to now call upon and introduce our first chair, Peter Allan, who is Honorary Scientist of UKRI STFC. Peter has been with STFC Food Network right from the very beginning, since 2017, and he is also on our steering committee board. He is chairing our steering committee. So thank you, Peter, for being here, and stage is all yours.
Okay, thank you. I was looking for something festive to wear, and I found my Christmas tie. It used to be musical, and it's probably a good thing that it's no longer anymore, because it would go off at random times. Right, could I ask Dan, Patrick and Melina to come up to their named places up here? Right, so I'll ask each of you to just spend 2 minutes on your project, and then we'll go back around doing the things that worked well and the things that might have gone better, and go on into general discussions. Yeah. Okay, so first person to speak is Dr. Dan Evans, who is a lecturer in soil science at Cranfield University. And okay, I have a slide.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session, and thank you also to Stowell for the leadership and the network in the last couple of years that I've been a part of it. It's been a wonderful experience. I'm a lecturer in soil science, and this was very much about how we introduce new food growing spaces into towns and cities. And we realised from the beginning of the project that we had 2 problems to address. The first is that actually within towns and cities, space is at a premium. And so we needed to find new, perhaps underutilized, perhaps vacant areas for new food growing opportunities. The second issue was that where we have food growing, there's often a less of an investment into some of the other functions that are really important for sustainable food production. The soil formation, obviously being one of them, but also how we exchange knowledge, exchange that food, and how we perhaps create a cycle within the local community. For instance, how we provide composting services so that we keep everything locally and sustainable. Our approach was, in a sense, tripartite. So the first step we took, using some of the expertise of STFC data, was using machine learning to identify vacant and underutilized spaces within the town and city. We were working in Islington Borough, but this methodology can work outside of that. And then we collect data from these spaces and essentially triangulate the environmental, the spatial, and very importantly, the social characteristics of those spaces. That's really important for us, because then we're able to assign a score to each of those spaces. Some of them are better for producing food, some are better for distributing food, some are better for composting, and so on. And then finally, what we're using is a new model based on a Python code that we've created, which essentially takes all those scores and optimizes the space for the function. So the bottom line is that we can go to the community or go to the borough, the authority, whoever manages the land, and say, actually, you've got 6, 7, 8 underutilized spaces within a small area here, small distance between them. They can't all do everything, but each one can do something. And within one cluster, they can create one local sustainable food supply chain. That essentially was the project. And perhaps there's a discussion later on how we've moved on.
Okay.
That. So I'll hand over to Peter.
Thanks, Dan. Right. Patrick Stowell is a lecturer in particle physics at the University of Sheffield.
Yeah. Okay, so my sort of area is more on technology development. So I was actually involved in a few different STFC Food Network projects, all focused really on soils and how we can use mainly sort of radiation sensing and also some infrared sensing to understand soil texture and soil moisture, right? So we're trying to look at drainage rates across a field, how that varies at the level of actually like individual plants, so that you can use that for things like precision irrigation or precision fertilizer application. So actually the very first slide that you showed on the sort of UAV was one project we had looking at infrared scanning that produced, I realized in the project only when we started, sort of several terabytes of data per scan. That was kind of too much that a farmer could realistically process. But the one that is sort of my favorite, actually, that I am a bit biased towards is neutron sensing because of my background. So there's a technique that allows you to actually measure soil moisture over really large areas by putting just standard neutron sensors above a field, and you can just continuously monitor soil moisture over time. So we had a project actually with the Food Network deploying some of these sensors in a farm in Newcastle to kind of prove their viability. And what we did was actually try to drive down the costs of standard neutron sensors. So usual ones in the nuclear industry are about £10,000. In the Food Network project, we kind of try to drive that down to 1,500. We now have a design which is around £200. So it's several orders of magnitude that we've dropped it by, and the sort of extension for that after the Food Network project was we've had some, if you go on to the next slide, if I have two slides on here, I think I do. Yeah, we've had a load of trials now in Brazil in areas where they basically continuously irrigate, where we deploy, you know, before maybe a farmer might at a push be able to buy one sensor. Now we deploy like arrays of these sensors over a field to completely map soil moisture over really large sites. And we actually mount them onto the irrigation arms themselves. So we're doing these trials at the moment where these sensors can just sweep around a field and continuously monitor soil moisture. And for them, the big thing is actually not necessarily just the optimization, but actually being able to go back to the local communities and tell them, you know, the local council, this is how much water we need, because they have this constant battle trying to argue that, you know, the water that they're taking from the local rivers is too much and they need to cut it down. And what they need to prove is actually that if they cut it down any further, the yields that they will get will start to be kind of not worth it in the first place. So you'll have lots of farms all operating at lower efficiency than if you just had one or two farms which are actually allowed to take the water. So yeah,
Okay, thank you. On to Melina Zempila, who's Earth Observation Scientist at Valspace STFC.
Hello, it's a pleasure being with you today. So our feasibility project funded by the STFC Food Network 2 years ago was focusing on the remote sensing of early disease symptoms in wheat plants, and we were focusing on yellow and brown rust. It was an ambitious project because of the fact that yellow rust grows towards the inner leaves and the lower leaves. So it was a challenge to be able to remote sense early symptoms of the disease. So farmers would have an alert tool in order to prevent the spread of the disease. So in order to address this problem, we have designed like two independent but complementary experimental approaches, having a static hyperspectral imagery performed in the lab under known environmental factors, and check the effects of the progression of the disease in the plants throughout the whole lifetime of the disease progress from day zero from the inoculation until the 25th day where the plants are expected to eventually die. And then we have also deployed the exact same hyperspectral imaging system on our drone, and we have performed the same experimental approach, but from an aerial platform in order to be able to remote sense the early disease symptoms. And as you can see, we have some interesting results. We have developed a machine learning model that is able not only to identify whether a plant is diseased or not, but it can only classify the level of the disease in the plant.
Okay, thank you all. Right, so I'll now move on to asking about what went well and what might have gone better. So Dan, what worked well for you?
I think for me and the project, the real celebration that we had all the way through is working with the local community.
Right.
We're talking about not working within our own bubbles, but reaching out to the indigenous communities. In our case, it was the local community of Islington Borough. And we found that they had particular preferences for how their spaces around their local areas were being used. So theoretically, using the environmental and spatial data alone, we optimized some spaces for food growing and realized when we came to the community that those spaces were actually used by them for other things. And so I think that was one of the successes for us was, and one of the things that I think part of the values of this network is that we were triangulating with not just the objective technical data, but working with the local communities, their perspectives, their experiences, their lives and livelihoods within the environments that we were studying. We weren't doing helicopter research, in other words.
Right.
So I think that worked well.
Right.
The thing that perhaps didn't work so well was how do we obtain data that we can use in our model from the local community? You know, we have soil pH, we have mean annual temperature. These are values we can obtain fairly easily. Spatial characteristics of the space, the geometry, we were able to measure those rather objectively. But when we went out to the community and we held an open day with the community and we showed them our work at that point, based on those two very objective variables, they said, well, yeah, but I think this would be better here, or I think I'd like, you know, this part, not for food production, but for leisure. How do you include that information within a mathematical model? And we are still grappling with that. There are ways in which we're trying to work with social scientists in that regard. But that was something that was challenging, something I think which is a science and technology challenge as much as a social science challenge.
Yeah. And do you think that that's just the nature of people and you would expect similar things in a completely different area, or you'd expect to get completely different things and you've got no idea what they are?
It's very possible, because what we realized is that the communities that we were working with all the way throughout the project were very diverse communities, lots of different backgrounds. I mean, it's the case in most towns and cities that you get some sense of melting pot, but particularly within Islington Borough, we had a very diverse demographic. So not only were we receiving qualitative data, which was difficult to include in the models, but we were receiving very different qualitative data, and balancing that up, weighting that up within the model was very difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, Patrick, what worked well for you?
Yeah. So, yeah, I obviously came from a particle physics background. I think the thing that actually was quite a surprise to me and I really liked is that when I told all the physicists that I was going to sort of stop building radiation sensors for farmers, they kind of were like, they won't be interested. That's ridiculous. But the actual buy-in I had was actually really surprising and really nice. And the links that I got from the Food Network were really important in that. So we had, you know, crop health and protection. They were really invested in the first trials we had at Newcastle University and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And I think that worked really well, because it meant really early on in our sort of development cycle, we're on sort of version 3 of a design of a sensor that we're hoping we're going to commercialize soon. But we had like direct inputs that basically said, these are the things that will not work. You know, we had different ideas for how we would get data and stuff like that, and how we would service things in the field. And straight away we got input that was just like, that's wrong, basically, which is really useful, right? It's really important. I think the things that kind of didn't go well, not just for that project, but also the sort of things like the infrared projects I had, was that, again, I think it's partially sort of ingrained in us as physicists. We want to make things kind of perfect and get as much data as we possibly can. And the realization was very early on that, you know, if you produce a scan of a field and it produces something like a terabyte worth of data, and then a farmer needs to spend several days processing that on a computer, it doesn't actually work in practice. And it made us realize that we needed to, you know, really focus on working backwards, which is, you know, the right way to do things, but it's easy to kind of get lost in the technology and want to just develop things as scientists. So that didn't really work very well at the start. And we had sort of similar problems, kind of similar to Dan, actually, that then when you start taking these nice new data sets you have, you then still need to think about how you merge it with like a bigger model that's actually, you know, the thing that they're going to use. Like one of the things we're looking at now is crop modeling and how you actually take that data and feed it directly in. And we have exactly the same problem. You have a load of extra inputs which are purely qualitative. I need to figure out how you're going to marry them, which is very hard.
Yeah. Okay, Melina, what worked well?
Well, being part of the food network worked really well on knowing people, knowing the community, identifying the problems that farmers actually have in a practical way, and for us from the remote sensing community to see how we can support them in addressing these problems in the most effective way. We were lucky enough, we had good weather to fly our drone over the field, and we didn't have any technical issues. So we've created terabytes of hypercubes. Our sensors really behaved in the lab, in the field, and we had an excellent support from the agronomists that have identified the disease. We flew over the fields in different growth seasons, because we didn't know at the time what we were looking to see. And having this ability to communicate with the food court networks and get the support from the team was very essential. What hasn't gone as expected, let's say, it was that we didn't take into account different varieties of wheat. So the field trials had different varieties that created a little bit of an issue with regards to the machine learning classification algorithm, something that it was the nitty-gritty detail that we missed during the project conceptualization. And the second thing was that the plants were really shown quite sparsely, which is not something typically done in reality. And we had this soil interference, but all in all, a very good experience. Looking forward to the next chapter.
Okay, thank you. So what are your top tips for taking things forward? If you're doing this again or doing it differently, doing some new project, top tips. Melina, have you first?
Well, what I've realized throughout the years and through this project is that you cannot plan, you cannot foresee problems. So that's what always happens when you're in the field, when you have to do with instrumentation technology. So just discuss, ask questions, don't assume anything, don't take anything from granted. Apart from that, something will definitely go wrong. Make sure that you've got everything, make sure that you know your system, you're well equipped in addressing everything. I had to install software in the middle of the field, and I was lucky enough that I had the drivers and the ability to do so. So just make sure that you've got everything you need, plan well, and don't panic. Keep calm and keep going.
Okay, thanks. Dan.
I think
tips.
for me, it was expectations management for the local community. When you go into a borough, people who are food deprived in many cases, actually, and you go in and say, we've got a project looking at how to expand food production in your area, then immediately they think, great, in a year or so's time, we're going to see new allotments, new vegetable patches, new orchards, trees and whatnot. And trying to differentiate the project, which was for us a science and technology based project. It was about ascertaining a method, developing a method that would enable local organisations, borough councils and so on to optimise the spaces they had for food growing. It wasn't implementing that in real space. So going into the local community and being absolutely clear and precise about what the outcomes of the project would be. I think it will, in what Stowell was saying earlier, the funding of the project ends here, but it doesn't mean that things can't develop after the project. So for us, we went in and said, we've got a 2-year project. That's not long enough to do all of the work plus implementing these solutions. So we're going to do the work. We're going to report to the Borough Council, who manages and owns the land. And then after the project, we won't go away. We'll stay with you. And although unfunded, we'll keep the communication open so that if you need to work further and closer with us in terms of implementing the findings and to create that impact, then that's really important. But that key thing at the start, going to a community and saying, you will not likely see a new allotment in this area overnight, but we will get a solution that helps the borough in managing that decision better.
Yeah, I think that's particularly important when you're speaking to an audience which is completely different from any that you've spoken to before, because when you're dealing with your scientific colleagues, you speak in a certain way, and they're expecting to hear certain things, and they will hear those certain things. And when you've got a completely different audience, they may be expecting to hear things, and they'll probably hear what they want to hear. So you have to be absolutely clear and probably repeat it 3 times so that it's absolutely clear what you are doing. Yes. Patrick.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what Melina was saying. I think you can't necessarily assume that anything that works in a lab will work in the field. That's probably my first one. And you'll always have issues that you just didn't foresee. We had issues. One of our sensor sites got ransacked by monkeys. I remember that was something that we were kind of surprised by.
Was it
redesign how it sort of connectors and things like that. And the other one more on the sort of route to impact. I think the one thing to bear in mind is that sometimes good enough is better than trying to get to the best possible solution. Right? Having something which provides impact fast and is at a level that actually people need is far more important than being the best that you can possibly be, just because that takes a lot longer to get to.
Yeah. Yes, good enough is good enough.
Yeah.
Okay, any final thoughts before we open the floor up to questions? Okay, so questions from the audience, please. Oh, there must be lots of questions. So, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Microphone coming.
Yeah. Sarah, do you?
Has the question from the line?
Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Would you like to do that one first?
Yeah, we'll take. So we've got an online question from David Hughes. What is the link between neutrons hitting a detector and soil moisture? Where are the neutrons coming from?
Yeah, so the technique that we use relies on cosmic rays. So you get this sort of rain that comes down of particles from outer space that hit the upper atmosphere. And they produce lots of different particles, but one of the main ones that make it to sea level is neutrons. And neutrons don't actually interact with a lot, right? So they just kind of bounce around in the air. And the one thing they do interact with very strongly is hydrogen. So basically, when you have dry soil, the neutrons come in and they bounce off your soil and you can detect them above the ground. But when your soil is wet and it has a higher hydrogen content, they get absorbed in the soil. So it's very simple. You basically put a neutron sensor above a field and you measure the total counts you see. And basically, as the field gets wetter, you get less neutrons and you can calibrate that out. So it's very simple technique. The main sort of limiting factor is the price of neutron sensors themselves. So that's why that's been the major focus. How do we develop alternative sensors that are both cheaper, but also more robust and can handle sort of being thrown off the back of a tractor and things like that, which is, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much. So, is this working with me? Thanks so much for all three of you, Dan, Patrick and Melina. I'll ask you at lunchtime because I'll be too excited and take too long. Dan, one of the things I did, because I'm a technologist as well, and that's one of the things I did do. I was chairman of Andover Town Council for many years, and the allotments from the red into the black, the culture of allotment. That was unbelievable. We spoke to I can't remember the name of the town up north to get some advice on to get the lemons good. The culture of football allotments is different from the culture of people who do allotments in Andover. And I thought what you said about the diversity, if I pick you up niggling and I take you over to Brazil, where Patrick was, and say, you did over there, it would be different, wouldn't it? And if we took you over to, I don't know, India or Portugal, another country, well, it's different. I just think one of the things we did in the past with Kevin Smith is batteries. We put sociologists into a batteries innovation conference. They cause chaos. I just think almost in the back of my mind going forward, and I do think you should be funded, by the way, to do more work, is there a sociologist in the house? Do you think that's actually viable to take on some sociology scientists or appropriate community type experts to help what you're actually all three of you working on? Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks.
And absolutely, I think it would be the first answer, the short answer. We've got subsequent funding as a result of the STFC network, projects developing in Canada, Venice, Malaga, and Barcelona at the moment. And all of these are very different areas, different environmental contexts, different spatial contexts, of course, but most importantly, different social, cultural, and economic contexts. And one of the things we've started to do in this project, across all of these projects, but in our program of projects, is the first thing we do is to go to the local community and find someone who's there on the ground, who knows the area. So I absolutely agree. I think in the future, we need a sociologist or an ethnographer on the team, but also we need someone who's there as our local link, our mediator between what we're doing back in the lab, so to speak, and the areas that we're working in. So yes, definitely that social science expert, but also a local expert. Sometimes they're not exactly the same people. Often, actually, they're not.
Okay, thanks. Do we have any more questions from the audience here? Okay, if not, then back all the speakers.